Alright, so today we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So go ahead and turn there with me and get started here. So starting in verse 1, it says, "Now regarding the questions you asked in your letter." Okay, so you know that this church at Corinth has Paul, we know, wrote a letter previous to this to the church of Corinth, and obviously they responded and wrote him back at some point and even asked him some questions. And so this is some of the things they asked him. So, now regarding the questions you asked in your letter, yes, it is good to abstain from sexual relations. But because there is so much sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband. The husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. The wife gives authority over her body to her husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to his wife. Okay, so Paul says, God made man to have sexual desires and sexual needs that they need to fulfill. Okay, and this is why it's good for man to take a wife so that he doesn't sin against God. If God's blessed you with a spiritual gift of being able to refrain from having sex and not lust after women, or it cause you to sin against God, then that's great. You can focus all your attention on God, and there's no reason for you to get a wife. But most men do have things that they struggle with, and so it's better for them to get a wife. And it says because of the sexual need, and so a wife and a husband shouldn't refrain from fulfilling their sexual desires with each other, because this is the whole point of having a marriage. Somebody that you can have a partner with in your relationship with God and seeking God and fighting the spiritual battle. You can raise each other up in prayer. You can study the Word together, mutually strengthen each other's faith, help each other raising your children to love the Lord, but also to fulfill those sexual desires and those needs that you have, so that the devil doesn't outsmart you and it leads you into sin later. So you shouldn't use sex as a weapon against each other. Especially, I know women like to do this more often than not, and hold out from having sex with their husbands because they don't do something that pleases them or upsets them in some way or something. We really shouldn't do that. We shouldn't use sex as a weapon. Sex is something that God gave a man and a woman, or a husband and a wife, so that they can share this beautiful thing together. So in verse 5 it says, "Do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time, so that you can give yourselves more completely to prayer." In some translations say fasting and prayer. "Afterward you should come together again, so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So it is perfectly okay to refrain from sexual relations, agreeing on this together for a time to seek God more, and completely focus some time on God. And I think that's a very good thing to do, at least, regularly, if not, maybe once a month, once a year, something, to really, grow closer to God and really just weaken your flesh and strengthen your spirit, and have a time of fasting and prayer and seeking God more. And he says, "Afterward you should come together again, so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control." Men do struggle with this. So women, when you think that you're somehow gaining control in a relationship by holding out sex, and trying to hurt your husband, or get him to do things that you want him to do by controlling the sex in the relationship, you're actually hurting yourself. You're causing that. Hopefully you're not causing him to sin against you. Hopefully the man has enough self-control not to sin or fall into temptation anyways, but you're putting him at higher risk, by fulfilling his sexual desires and his needs. He has no reason to start lusting after other women, or looking at things on the internet and different things. And I'm not saying that that's an excuse for them to do that. They shouldn't do that regardless. Single men, shouldn't do that, do those things. We should focus on the Lord, but I'm just saying, it might actually backfire on you to do those things, and it's not biblical. So verse 6, "I say this as a concession, not as a command, but I wish everyone were single just as I am, Yet each person has a special gift from God, one kind or another. So Paul's saying this is a special gift that he's been given from God to focus all of his attention on God and not take a wife. At least at this point in his life, he hasn't. So, in verse 8, so I say to those who aren't married and to widows, it's better to stay unmarried, just as I am. But if they can't control themselves, they should go ahead and marry. It's better to marry than to burn with lust. So this whole chapter is going to be talking about marriage, and he's saying that the best thing to do is to stay unmarried if you can do that without sinning against God. If you can stay unmarried your entire life and focus 100% of your attention on the Lord all the time, that's the best and most perfect way to live. But most of us can't do that. And he says if you can't do that, it's better to marry than to burn with lust. If being single is causing you to sin, causing you to lust, causing you to think lustful thoughts, or causing you to have sex outside of marriage, then you need to get married. Because whichever way helps you focus on the Lord the most, you need to do that. And like I said, most of us, I'd say probably 95 to 99% of men cannot go their entire lives without taking a wife and not sinning against God in some way. So we really need to focus on that. That's the reason God gave us wives. That's the reason God gave Adam Eve, because He's seen it's not good for man to be alone. It's better for us to have somebody to love and to love us and to hold each other up in these areas. Verse 10, but for those who are married, I have a command that comes not from me, but from the Lord. A wife must not leave her husband, but if she does leave him, let her remain single or else be reconciled to him. And the husband must not leave his wife. So if you ever get married, God wants you to stay with that person. And if you ever do get divorced or leave him, He wants you to be reconciled with that person in some way, and save that marriage if at all possible. Now I will speak to the rest of you, in verse 12. Though I do not have a direct command from the Lord, if a fellow believer has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to continue to living with him, he must not leave her. For if a believing woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to continue living with her, she must not leave him. For the believing wife brings holiness to her marriage, and the believing husband brings holiness to his marriage. Otherwise your children would not be holy, but now they are holy. Okay? But if the husband or wife who isn't a believer insists on leaving, then let them go. In such cases, the believing husband or wife is no longer bound to the other, for God has called you to live in peace. Okay, so obviously this is talking about if you're already married and you become a believer, then if your husband or wife is not a believer, you should stay with them and do your best to live out this Christian walk in front of them, and hopefully that someday, you don't know if maybe your walk can lead that person to the Lord, if they're willing to stay with you. If they're not willing to stay with you, then and they want to divorce you because they can't get behind the way that you live, or for whatever reason they want to, then you're no longer bound to that marriage. God, Paul says that God has freed you from that because He wants you to live in peace, and it's not up to you. But if both of you are believers, it's different. You need to do everything you can to keep that marriage going and keep it alive. Because that's what God says. What God has joined, let no man separate. Verse 16, don't you wives realize that your husbands might be saved because of you? And don't you husbands realize that your wives might be saved because of you? Okay, verse 17, each of you should continue to live in whatever situation the Lord has placed you, and remain as you were when God first called you. This is my rule for all the churches. For instance, a man who was circumcised before he became a believer should not try to reverse it. Okay? And the man who was uncircumcised when he became a believer should not be circumcised now. For it makes no difference whether or not a man has been circumcised. The important thing is to keep God's commandments. Okay? Yes, each of you should remain as you were when God called you. Verse 21. Are you a slave? Don't let that worry you, but if you get a chance to be free, take it. Okay? And remember, if you were a slave when the Lord called you, you are now free in the Lord. And if you were free when the Lord called you, you are now a slave of Christ. So we should all live like that. God paid a high price for you. So don't be enslaved by the world. Each of you, dear brothers and sisters, should remain as you were when God first called you. So don't think just because you're a Christian now that you have to try to to change your situation. If you're single, you have to hurry up and try and get married now. If you're married, you have to, try and get rid of your wife so that you can focus everything on God. Or, if you he even talks about slaves and free men. If you're free, you're now Christ's slave. So act like it. But if you're a slave, don't think that it's wrong. Like you need to try to gain your freedom. Now you're already free in Christ, anyways. But if you can gain your freedom, then you should do that. Verse 25. Now regarding your question about the young women who are not yet married, I do not have a command from the Lord for them, but the Lord in His mercy has given me wisdom that can be trusted, and I will share it with you. Because of the present crisis, I think it is best to remain as you are. If you have a wife, do not seek to end the marriage. If you do not have a wife, do not seek to get married. But if you do get married, it is not a sin. And if a young woman gets married, it is not a sin. However, those who get married at this time will have troubles, and I'm trying to spare you those problems. Okay, He's trying to spare people the problems of marriage. Verse 29, but let me say this, dear brothers and sisters, the time that remains is very short. So from now on, those with wives should not focus only on their marriage, okay? Those that are married should live as though they're not, in the sense that just because you're married and you have a wife to please now, y'all should be focused on the Lord, and working together for Him. Live as though you're not married. Don't let your marriage be your only focus on life. Your main focus should still be working for Jesus, working for the Lord. We only have so much time here. He says the time is short. So from now on, those that are married, live as though you're not in the sense of acting like, oh, you don't have a wife, so going after other women. No, live as though you're not, as though your focus isn't just on being with your wife all the time, but your focus is on working for the Lord, and y'all two working for the Lord together, and y'all will meet at the Lord there. So those who weep or rejoice or who buy things should not be absorbed by their weeping or their joy or their possessions. Verse 31, those who use the things of the world should not become attached to them, for this world, as we know it, will soon pass away. So we should never become attached to the things of this world, not just material things, but our wives or husbands. We know that when we're in heaven, we're not going to be given in marriage. No one's going to be married or given in marriage. We're going to be like the angels. So we have a wife or a husband while we're here. That's great. The Lord has blessed us with that. A man who finds a good wife, finds great riches. But we should live and seek things that are going to last for eternity. Be good husbands, be good wives, be good fathers, and be good mothers, the best that you can, but understand that your main focus should be the Lord, always. Verse 32, I want you to be free from the concerns of this life. An unmarried man can spend his time doing the Lord's work and thinking how to please Him. But a married man has to think about his earthly responsibilities and how to please his wife. Okay, so his interests are divided. In the same way, a woman who is no longer married or has never been married can be devoted to the Lord and holy in body and in spirit. But a married woman has to think about her earthly responsibilities and how to please her husband. I am saying this for your benefit, not to place restrictions on you. I want you to do whatever will help you serve the Lord best with as few distractions as possible. So Paul's explaining this to us so that we can take whatever is the best way that we think we can serve the Lord, whether it's staying single and focusing everything on God, or getting married so that we don't sin against God. Whichever is the best way to serve the Lord, then do this. He's not saying this to place restrictions on you. He's trying to help us discover what's the best way to serve the Lord. We don't want our interests divided if we don't have to do that. So verse 36, but if a man thinks he's treating his fiancée improperly and will inevitably give in to his passion, let him marry her as he wishes. It is not a sin. But if he has decided firmly to marry and there is no urgency, and he can control his passion, or not to marry, and he can control his passion, he does well not to marry. So the person who marries his fiancée does well, and the person who doesn't marry does even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. If her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but only if he loves the Lord. But in my opinion, it would be better for her to stay single, and I think I'm giving you counsel from God's Spirit when I say this. Okay? So all that's pretty self-explanatory. I know some of it's kind of hard to understand because of the way the world is nowadays, but that's just giving it to you straight from Paul, from the Holy Spirit. So y'all keep seeking truth. Until next time, God bless you.